This is the Republic by Plato, Part 6, the status of women. He argues for about a few pages about why he sort of refusing to bring up women, because it's obviously an incredibly risky subject to be addressing, particularly at this time in history where women were property. He says, "You don't know what a hornet's nest you're stirring up by bringing up the subject. I deliberately avoided it before because I saw all the trouble it would cause." So he has two other people asking him all about the state. And a lot of people argue that this was a device so that he could bring up things that he wanted to bring up and have them come up with objections competitors would come up with. But the character of Socrates eventually goes on to start. "Well then," I began, "we must go back and pick the subject up again. We ought perhaps to have discussed it in its proper place, but maybe it's a good plan to let the women come on the stage now after the men have played their part, especially in view of your challenge. We can, I think, only make satisfactory arrangements for the possession and treatment of women and children by men born and educated as we have described. If we stick to the course on which we started, our object, you remember, was to make them watchdogs, gardening flock. Yes. Let us then proceed to arrange for their birth and upbringing accordingly. We can then see if it suits our purpose." "How do you mean?" "What I mean is this. Ought female watchdogs to perform the same guard duties as male, and watch and hunt and so on with them? Or ought they to stay at home on the grounds that the bearing and rearing of their puppies incapacitates them from other duties, so that the whole burden of the care of the flocks falls on the males? They should share all duties, though we should treat the females as the weaker, the males as the stronger." "And can you use any animal for the same purpose as another?" I asked, "unless you bring it up and train it in the same way?" "No. So if we're going to use men and women for the same purposes, we must teach them the same things, yes. We educated the men both physically and mentally, yes. We shall have to train the women also then, in both kinds of skill, and train them for war as well, and treat them in the same way as men." "It seems to follow from what you said," he agreed. "I dare say," I rejoined, that their novelty would make many of our proposals seem ridiculous if they were put into practice." "There's no doubt about that," he said. "And won't the most ridiculous thing of all be to see the women taking exercise naked with the men in the gymnasium? It won't only be the young women, there will be elderly women too, just as there are old men who go on with their exercises when they are wrinkled and ugly to look at." "Lord," he said, "that's going to be a funny sight by present standards." "Still," I said, "now we've launched out on the subject, we must not be afraid of the clever jokes that are bound to be made about all the changes that follow in the physical training and education of women, and above all about them being trained to carry arms and ride." "You are quite right. So having started off, we must go on to legislate for the real difficulties. We will ask the critics to drop their usual practice and to be serious for once, and remind them it was not so long ago that the Greeks thought, as most of the barbarians still think, that it was shocking and ridiculous for men to be seen naked. When the Cretans and later the Spartans first began to take exercise naked, wasn't there plenty of material for the wit of the comedians of the day? There was indeed. But when experience showed them it was better to strip than wrap themselves up, what reason had proved best lost its absurdity to the eye, which shows how idle it is to think anything ridiculous except what is wrong. Indeed, anyone who tries to raise a laugh at the sight of anything but what is foolish and wrong will never, when he is serious again, make goodness the object of his admiration." "That is certainly true," he said. The first thing we have to agree on, then, is whether these proposals are feasible or not. For whether it's asked in joke or in earnest, we must allow people to ask the question, is the female of the human species naturally capable of taking part in all the occupations of the male, or in none of them, or in some only? And if in some, is military service one of them? That's the best way to begin, and the way in which we are most likely to reach a fair conclusion. Yes, I agree. Then shall we ask ourselves the question on behalf of our imaginary critic, so this position does not go undefended? Go ahead. Let us then suppose him to say, my dear Socrates and Glaucon, there's really no need for the others to criticize you. You have yourselves at the beginning in the process of founding your state agreed on the principle that each man was naturally fitted for a particular job of his own. Yes, we must certainly admit that. Well, he will continue, isn't there a very great natural difference between men and women? And then we admit that too. He will ask us whether we ought not to give them different roles to match these natural differences. When we say yes, he will ask, then aren't you making a mistake and contradicting yourselves when you go on to say that men and women should follow the same occupations in spite of the great natural difference between them? What about that? Are you clever enough to answer him? It's not easy to answer on the spur of the moment, he replied. I can only turn to you and ask you to explain our case and reply, whatever it is. Now that's just what I was afraid of, Glaucon, I protested. I saw all this coming, and that's why I was so unwilling to start legislating about the possession of wives and bringing up children. It certainly doesn't look an easy job, he admitted. It isn't, I replied. The fact is that you've got to swim whether you're thrown into the swimming bath or into the middle of the sea. True enough. So we must swim on and try to keep our heads above water in this argument, in the hope of being rescued by Ariane's dolphin or some other miracle. Yes, I suppose we must. Well, let's see if we can find a way out. We admit that different natures ought to have different kinds of occupation, and that men and women have different natures, and yet we go on to maintain that these admittedly different natures ought to follow the same occupations. That is the charge we have to meet, isn't it? That is it. You know, Glaucon, it's extraordinary how powerful the influence of debating technique can be. In what way? I think a lot of people fall under it quite unconsciously and fail to see the difference between scoring points in debate and arguing seriously. They are unable to draw the distinctions in kinds needed for the discussion of a subject, and so get sidetracked into purely verbal contradiction. They aren't really arguing, but only scoring points. That does often happen, he agreed. But does it apply to us now? It certainly does. At any rate, I'm afraid we're unconsciously starting to score debating points. How? We are sticking obstinately to the verbal debating point that different natures should not be given the same occupations, but we haven't considered what kind of sameness or differences of nature we mean, and what our intention was when we laid down the principle that different natures should have different jobs, similar natures, similar jobs. No, we've not taken that into consideration. Yet we might just as well on this principle ask ourselves whether bald men and long-haired men are of the same or opposite natures, and having agreed that they are opposite, allow bald men to be cobblers and forbid long-haired men to be, or vice versa. That would be absurd. But the reason why it is absurd, I pointed out, is simply that we never meant that natures are the same or different in an unqualified sense, only with reference to the kind of sameness or difference which is relevant to various employments. For instance, we should regard a man and woman with medical ability as having the same nature. Do you agree? Yes. But a doctor and a carpenter we should reckon as having different natures. Yes, entirely. Then if men or women as a sex appear to be qualified for different skills or occupations, I said, we shall assign these to each accordingly. But if the only difference apparent between them is that the female bears and the male begets, we shall not admit this is a difference relevant for our purpose, but shall still maintain that our male and female guardians ought to follow the same occupations. And rightly so, he agreed. Then let us proceed to tell our opponent to tell us for what professions or occupations in the structure of society men and women are quite differently suited by nature. A fair question. But he may reply as you did just now, that it's not easy to answer on the spur of the moment. though there would be no great difficulty if we were given time to think. So shall we ask someone who makes this objection to follow us, and see if we can show him convincingly that there is no social function peculiar to women? Go ahead. Then let us ask him to answer this question. When you say a man has a natural capacity or incapacity for a subject, don't you mean that he learns it easily or finds it difficult, and that if his natural capacity is good, he can pick it up himself after a little instruction, whereas if it is bad, he can't remember what he's learned even after long instruction and practice? And if he has natural capacity, aren't his mind and body well coordinated if he hasn't uncoordinated? Aren't these a sort of criteria by which you distinguish natural capacity or lack of it? No one will deny that. Then, is there any human activity at which men aren't far better in all these respects than women? We need not waste time other exceptions like weaving and various cooking operations at which women are thought to be experts and get badly laughed at if a man does them better. It's quite true, he replied, that in general the one sex is much better at everything than the other. A good many women, it is true, are better than a good many men at a good many things, but the general rule is as you stated it. There is therefore no administrative occupation which is peculiar to a woman, as woman, or man, as man. Natural capacities are similarly distributed in each sex, and it is natural for women to take part in all occupations as well as men, though in all women will be weaker partners. Agreed. Are we therefore to confine all occupations to men only? How can we? Obviously we can't, for we are agreed, I think, that one woman may have a natural ability for medicine or music, another not. Yes, one may be good at athletics, another have no taste for them. One be good at soldiering, another not. I think so. Then may a woman not be philosophic or unphilosophic, high-spirited or spiritless? She may. Then there will also be some women fitted to be guardians, for those natural qualities, you'll remember, were those which we picked our men guardians. Yes, there were. So men and women have the same natural capacity for guardianship, save in so far as woman is the weaker of the two. That is clear. We must therefore pick suitable women to share the life and duties of guardian with men, since they are capable of it, and the natures of men and women are akin. Yes. And the same natures should follow the same pursuits, shouldn't they? Yes. We come back again, then, to our former position, and agree that it is unnatural that our guardians, wives, should share their intellectual and physical training. There's no doubt about it. So our proposed legislation was no impossible daydream. We were legislating in accordance with nature, and it is our present contrary practice which now seems unnatural. It looks like it. We set out, didn't we, to discover whether our proposals were practicable, and whether they were best that could be made. We did. We have now agreed that they are practicable. Yes. Then we must go on to settle whether they are the best, clearly. Well then, to make a woman into a guardian, we presumably need the same education as we need to make a man into one, especially as it will operate on the same nature in both. True. There's another point I'd like your opinion on. What is it? Do you suppose some men are better than others, or are equal? They certainly aren't all equal. Then, in our imaginary state, which will produce the better men, the education which we prescribe for the guardians, or the training our shoemakers get? It's absurd to ask. All right, so the guardians will be the best citizens, far the best. Then won't the women guardians be the best women? Much the best again. And is there anything better for a state than to produce men and women of the best possible kind? No. But that is the result of the education of body and mind which we have described. Of course it is. The arrangements we proposed are not only possible, but also best our state could have. Yes. Our women guardians must strip for exercise. Then their excellence will be all the clothes they need. They must play their part in war and in all other duties of a guardian, which will be their sole occupation. Only as they are the weaker sex, we must give them lighter share of the duties than men. And any man who laughs at a woman, who for these excellent reasons exercise themselves naked, is, as Pindar says, picking the unripe fruit of laughter. He does not know what he is laughing at, or what he is doing, for it is, and will always be the best of sayings, that what benefits us is fair, what harms us is shameful. I agree entirely.